Chapter 7 of Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs. E. J. Burhill and Mrs. J. B. Drake. The Three Little Eggs, a Swazi Tale. It was very early morning in midwinter. The sun was just rising over the great plains in a silver haze, which melted into pale gold as the wide stretches of veldt came into view, burnt dry with the summer heats. The rains had long ago been over. The sun shone every day and all day, with a pleasant temperate heat in a clear heaven. The whole country appeared golden, save where the watercourses ran, and a few great evergreen trees stood up in vivid contrast to the bleached summer grasses. By the side of a great fig tree there was one poor little hut surrounded by a plaited fence. Close to it was a little patch of cultivated ground, where a few dried mealie stalks were still standing. The air was very cold and raw, and chilled you through and through, but the sun had barely touched the top of the great tree when a woman came out hurriedly from the hut and passed through the kraal gate. You could see she was a married woman by her full kilt of black ox skins and her curious peaked headdress. Besides, she carried on her back the dearest little baby girl, wrapped in a goatskin and half asleep, and by her side ran a merry little boy. The mother herself was still young and pretty, but her face was worn and thin, and if you had looked close, you would have seen that her arms were covered with scars and burns, as if she had been badly used. She stood for a few minutes and looked first towards the wide plains. Then she turned to the other side, where great hills rose up, ruddy and golden in the early sun. She seemed to hesitate. Then she turned to the mountains, and was soon on a tiny pathway which led by many windings to a wooded gorge hundreds of feet above the plains. She did not sing as she went, and often cast frightened looks behind her. But no one followed, and after a time, as the hut disappeared from view and the sun made all things warm and pleasant, she grew less anxious and went on her way more quietly. For she was running away from her husband. She had been married now 4 years, and every year he had been more unkind. He not only worked her very hard and gave her scarcely anything to eat, but also often beat her, and had even branded her with hot irons till she screamed with pain. She was good and obedient and tried hard to please him, but he only became more and more cruel to her and her children. 2 days before, he had gone off to a big dance in a faraway kraal. The poor woman so dreaded his return that she decided to run away and beg her living as best she could. She knew there were great chiefs on the other side of the mountains, and big cities. She was a good worker. Doubtless they would give her food. She walked on, and the baby girl woke up and began to laugh and play. They were now following the course of a stream, but only a tiny trickle of water remained, and the ferns were withered, and the thick bushes dry and leafless. All at once the mother saw a fluffy white nest hanging on a long bough. "How pretty," said she. "That will be the very thing to amuse baby." She went to the bough and detached the soft white nest, while her little son looked on with much interest. To her great surprise, for it was yet many months to springtime, she found it contained 3 little eggs. "Hold it fast," said she to her little one, "and do not smash the little eggs on any account." Then she journeyed on once more. The sun was sinking fast, and the air grew colder and colder, for on the hilltops there is sharp frost every night. No hut was in sight, though they were now on more level ground, and the poor mother had no covering but her one goatskin and no food. "Where shall I rest tonight?" said she to herself. "There is nothing to be seen but the open country." Then she heard a tiny voice at her ear. "Take the road to the right. It will lead you to a safe place." She turned and looked, and found it was one of the little eggs in the fluffy white nest. In very truth, she saw there was a tiny path to the right, which she had not noticed before. She took it at once, and just as the sun disappeared and the white frost began to show, she found a beautiful hut under the side of a great rock. No one seemed to live there, but it was warm and cozy and all ready for her use. Beautiful carosses of ox-skin and goat-skin hung on the walls. Food was there already prepared in little red pots, crushed mealies and monkey nuts, and in the calabashes was abundance of delicious thick milk. Footnote: Carosses, rugs made of skins or of bark, beautifully sewn together. Thick milk. This is a maas or maase, a preparation of sour milk. Kaffirs never drink fresh milk, but let it stand in special pots till curds have formed. End of footnote. The little boy and baby girl cried with delight, and you can imagine how pleased the poor mother was. The little nest was first carefully laid aside. Then both mother and children ate a good meal, for they were very hungry. The little boy fell asleep at once, covered with the warm skins, but his sister cried and would not lie down quietly. So her mother tied her on her back once more and sang the Kaffir cradle song, which is as pretty a thing as you will hear. She swung gently to and fro, moving her arms as well in time to the low chant. Tulam twana, pindam twana, unina ufulela, unina ufulela, tulam twana. Be quiet, my baby, be still, my child. Your mother has gone to get green mealies. Your sisters are all gone gathering wood. So be quiet, baby, be still. Your father has gone a-walking. He has gone to drink good beer. Your mother is working with a will. So be quiet, baby, be still. Soon the tiny black head leaned forward, the little round arms relaxed, and baby girl was fast asleep. The tired mother laid her down, and in a few moments was dreaming by her children's side. The next morning they set forth again, much refreshed. They continued on the same path, and baby girl carried the little eggs as before. Towards midday they came to a place where two ways met. The mother stood looking at the two paths for a long while, uncertain which to take. Then a tiny voice spoke in her ear. It was the second little egg this time. "Take the road to the left," said he. So she turned and followed the left-hand path till she came in sight of an enormous hut, 3 times as big as any she had ever seen before. She went straight up to it and looked in at the door, full of curiosity. It was like no hut she had ever seen. The calabashes and pots were all blood red in colour and very thin. As the breeze came in at the door, they swayed like bubbles and nearly fell, for they were as light as air. One big pot was blown right across the room, and as the poor mother's eyes followed it, she all but screamed aloud, for on the other side lay a huge monster fast asleep. He was immensely tall and very stout. His body was covered in tufts of brick-red hair. On his head were 2 horns, and his long tail lay curled across his knees. He was an Nzimu, without any doubt, and if he awoke, he would kill the mother and both her babies and eat them up. Footnote: An Inzimu, or Imbula, answers most nearly to the ogre of European fairy tales. He is semi-human and prefers the flesh of man to any other. An ogress is called Nzulukumbi. Both have light-coloured skins and red hair. End of footnote. "Whatever shall I do?" cried the mother as she ran from the door. "My little ones will both be killed." Then the third little egg spoke up. "Do you see that big stone? Carry it with you and climb on top of the hut." The mother looked round, for many rocks were near. She soon saw a round white stone, just of a size to drop through the thatched roof of the hut and kill anyone it fell on. But it was far beyond her power to lift it. "However can I pick it up?" said the poor woman. "It is so heavy." "Do as I bid you," said the egg. So she stooped down and tried to lift the stone. To her great surprise, she found it quite light and took it to the back of the hut. Then she lifted her babies onto the roof and climbed up herself afterwards with the stone in her hand. "Now let the stone drop on top of the monster," said the egg. The mother was just peering through the thatch to find the exact spot under which the monster lay, when the door opened and in came a second ogre, dragging after him several dead bodies. "Now we shall certainly be seen," said the mother. "All is over." But she kept quiet and did not move. The second Inzimu began to chop up one of his victims for the evening meal. Once he stopped, sniffing the air, and said, "There is something good hidden in this hut, but I can't make out where it is." He looked all round carefully, but never thought of the roof, and presently put his supper on to boil and sat down to watch it. Soon both Inzimus were fast asleep. The mother then looked at her stone and said, "Here are 2 Inzimus. I cannot kill both. What am I to do next?" "Come down as quietly as you can," said all the little eggs at once, "and run with the babies as fast as possible." She slipped quietly down, for the hut was round, and the little boy helped her with the baby. In a few minutes they were away, trembling in every limb, but the Inzimus did not wake up, and soon the big hut was out of sight. The poor mother breathed again and hoped that now at last she would find a kraal and human beings to talk to. The path wound in and out among bushes. They grew ever thicker and more thorny. Great trees began to appear, and it was soon impossible to walk save in the one direction. The path gave a sudden turn, and there, under a huge evergreen tree, was a horrible ogress. She lay right across the path, fast asleep, for the afternoon sun was warm. No doubt she was on her way home to the big hut. She was even uglier than the Inzimus, for she had a hideous snout like a wolf's, and one little horn just between her eyes. She snored most terribly, so that the branches of the tree shook. Then the mother thought her last hour had really come, for she could not return, and the bush was too thick on either side for her to escape. But the little eggs did not desert her. 2 little voices sounded together. "Look on your right. There lies a big axe." She looked, and sure enough, a great axe lay winking in the sun. It was so large that it must have belonged to the ogress, but the mother seized it quickly. "Now," said the little eggs again, "take that in your hand, go softly to the tree and lift your babies into the low branches. When they are safe, climb up yourself and creep along the great arm which is over the monster's head." The mother crept softly to the tree and lifted her little son up into the branches. The trunk was smooth and round like that of a beech at home, and the branches were many and not far from the ground. So the little boy was able to hold his baby sister when they were safe among the leaves. The mother mounted herself and crept forward right over the monster's head, the axe in her hand. She nearly fell off with fright, but the little eggs spoke again. "Aim the axe at the monster's head." She threw it with all her force and hit the ogress just above her horn, but she was only stunned, not killed. "Slip down from the tree," said the third little egg, "and chop off the monster's head quickly before she revives." The mother was down in a moment, ran forward with desperate courage, and in a few minutes she had severed the monster's head from its body. When it was done, she stood back to recover herself, but could scarcely believe her eyes as she looked. For out of the monster came men, women and children, cattle and goats, one after another, till they filled the path and had to pass along to open ground. Many hundreds appeared, for the ogress had eaten every kind of animal, and whole families of men in her wicked life. When all had come, there were enough to people a great kraal. Each one on his arrival turned to thank the poor mother and her children, and when all were there, the leaders came forward to ask her to be their queen. "But I should never have done it without the 3 little eggs," said she, and turned to show them the little white nest. She barely touched it with her hands when it vanished away, and instead appeared 3 handsome princes. The eldest took her hand and said, "You have freed us from a wicked enchantress by your courage. Your cruel husband is dead. He was killed in a quarrel the day you fled from home. Be my wife, and we will rule over these people forever." So the poor mother and her children found a happy home and much honour, and all the people shouted for joy, because they had now both a king and a queen. So ends the 3 Little Eggs. Chapter 8 of Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs E. J. Burhill and Mrs J. Drake. The Serpent's Bride, a Shangani story, Part 1. In the great wooded plains which lie between the mountains and the sea, there was once a most wonderful river. It was broad and deep, filling its banks from side to side. Great fig trees and white flowering thorns marked its course, and both winter and summer you could tell it afar off by the masses of evergreen foliage which followed its many windings. The land through which it flowed was fertile, and vast herds of goat and sheep fed on the neighbouring hills, for the grass was sweet and good. A powerful tribe had settled in these regions and had built themselves a big city on the side of a hill which sloped up from the river banks. There was abundance of wood and good water, and the city was well drained and faced the morning sun. Below the great kraal, the mealie fields extended almost to the riverside. The people had plenty of cattle, and their king was the richest and most powerful in the whole country. He was also a great hunter, for in the wide plains big game abounded, and his lion and tiger skins were wonderful to behold. Indeed, he had but one trouble. He and his people depended on the river for their daily supply of water, and every now and then it would suddenly cease to flow. The whole body of the river would dry up, sometimes in winter, but quite as often in the height of summer, when the rain fell daily and the great white clouds rose from the horizon every noon. No one knew why this strange thing would happen. Sometimes no water would appear for many days together, and all the women had to walk long hours through the forest to get fresh water from a distant stream. Only one princess could always fill her calabash, no matter how dry the riverbed. She was the most beautiful of all the king's daughters, tall and graceful, with a skin like satin and eyes that danced like sun upon the water. But she never went with her sisters to the river, and no one knew the source of her supply. They supposed she had found some hidden pool which never quite dried up, and did not wish to share her secret. Now the river had flowed steadily for many months. Spring had come, and then summer. The cornfields were in full ear, and the great tasselled mealies stood higher than a man's head. Every day all the princesses went down to the river to fetch water and bathe in the great red pool. Only Timba went alone, but her sisters had long ceased to notice her love of solitude. Then, one day, a strange thing happened. The morning was cool and fresh after a heavy thunderstorm. The tall grass was drenched with rain, and all the maidens from the neighbouring kraals came down to the river singing and laughing. There were tall, well-grown women, and slender girls, and even little maids of 5 and 6, each with a calabash on her head. They walked in single file, for the paths were narrow, and they shouted gaily to one another across the mealie fields. Only Timba was silent, and walked last of the line behind her sisters. At the riverside they all stopped, and cries of dismay broke from every mouth. The bed of the stream was all but empty. The rocks that were only visible at the end of winter stood high and dry. A tiny trickle of water still ran in the great red pool, but its banks of crimson earth were bare, and the waving reeds and bulrushes on the margin showed their mud-stained roots. In a few hours the little water still remaining would have disappeared in the heat of the summer sun. With heavy hearts the girls ascended the course of the stream to see if clear water still remained, but none could be found. Even the little watercourses lined with fern, which fed the great river, were dry. "It is no use," cried they. "We must take whatever water we can today, and tomorrow we must seek fresh streams." They returned home, their calabashes half full of muddy water, and told the bad news to the king. Only Timba's water was clear as crystal, and her jar was so full that she had placed branches of white flowering thorn round the brim to prevent it spilling over as she walked. The king was much disturbed to find that the river had failed once more. He set all his greatest magicians to work and promised unheard-of rewards to those who would bring water into the riverbed. But no incantations were of any avail. Rain doctors came from far away and cast their magic spells. But though great storms arose and passed over the land, the riverbed remained empty, and even the deepest water holes dried up. But Timba could still get water from the river, and every day she went down alone as often as she wished, and returned with her brimming calabash crowned with green leaves, her eyes brighter than ever and full of mysterious joy. Then her sisters asked at last, "Where do you get your water from?" And Timba made answer, "I get it from the great king of the waters. He commands the whole river and all the streams which run into it, even the tiniest creeks. He is angry now, and that is why the river is empty." Her sisters were still puzzled, for none of them had heard of any such king. In the meantime, winter approached with its unclouded skies. The crops were gathered in, the nights grew cold, and the air all day was fresh and crisp. No rain would fall now for many months, and the king and all his wise men knew that the river must remain empty till the spring. They were in great trouble, for they did not know how they would keep their cattle alive during the winter, and they even feared for themselves. Judge then of their amazement when they found one morning that the river was full to overflowing, as if in the height of the summer floods. No rain had fallen in the whole of the country. The people could only rejoice and wonder. That same day the beautiful princess came running up from the river, laughing and singing, and called her sisters together. "What is it? Tell us the news," said they, for they saw that something exciting had happened. "I am going to be married," said Timber joyfully. "But to whom?" "No suitor has been here for many months." "To the great king of the waters," said she with pride. "Who is he?" cried her sisters. "And where does he live? It must be far from here, for no one else has ever spoken of him." But Timber would not tell them. To all their questions she only nodded her head mysteriously and said, "I know." That evening, as the sun went down, she slipped out of the kraal and went to the river bank. The mealies were long since gathered, and the little path was beaten down hard and firm as the floor of a hut, for no rain had fallen this long while. She passed the red pool, now full from end to end, and followed the course of the river for half an hour or more, till she came to a great white thorn tree, surrounded by a tangle of creepers and flowering shrubs. There she stopped and pushed through the overhanging branches till she reached the water's edge. She stood there knee-deep among green lily leaves, and looked out on a wide expanse of water. It was still and dark and very deep, and the current was barely visible on its smooth surface. The banks enclosing it were of black earth, and at the water's edge grew great clumps of arum lilies, forming a thick belt of green. In summer, the black pool was a place of wonderful beauty. Now there were no lilies, and scarcely a blossom lingered on the bushes. A tiny crescent moon was sinking in the west, and the reflection of its silver horns quivered in mid-stream. As Timber waited and watched, a tiny ripple broke towards the bank, and the head of a great serpent arose. He was velvety black, save for 2 red circles round his glittering eyes, and his neck rose many feet out of the water. He swam straight to the princess, who did not scream and run away, but rose to greet him eagerly. The serpent coiled himself beside her on the bank, and his eyes shone with joy. "Do not let us wait any longer," said he. "Make all preparations for our marriage. As midwinter approaches, I will cause the river to rise twice in full flood. Then you will know I am waiting for you, so lose no time." They sat and talked till the little moon sank down and all the stars came out. Then the serpent rose up and swam away downstream, his head held high, and his huge length extending far behind it. This was the King of the Waters, who ruled the whole length of the great river, and it was he who had courted the princess night and morning as she came to fetch water. Timber watched him out of sight. Then she went home. The next day she and all her companions began to get ready for the marriage. Some of them wove mats out of the golden-coloured grasses, fine and soft enough to roll up into a tiny space. There were small mats to grind corn on, so that no meal should fall on the ground and be wasted, and there were other little mats to cut up meat on. Then there were long mats for sleeping on. These were made of bulrushes, and were to be put away all day and brought out only at night. The girls also took lengths of thin cloth, bought from faraway traders along the coast in exchange for ivory and horn, and fringed them with strings of many-coloured beads. These were cloaks for the bride, and were as graceful and pretty garments as you could wish to see. Then there were girdles to be made of coloured beads, and many necklaces, and all sorts of dainty ornaments fashioned with twisted wire. for Timber was a princess, and she was going to marry a king. All this took much time. Timber was at work all day, for in the winter the sun sets early, and for some weeks she never went to the river at all, nor did she see her strange lover once. But one morning towards the shortest day, a young man came running in from rabbit hunting in the hills, shouting that the river was in full flood. Timber's heart leapt, for this was the first of the promised signs. She worked still harder and hurried her maidens, for now only a few days could remain before the appointed time. At last all was ready, and she went down to walk by the river. The flood had passed, and only a tiny sluggish stream trickled in the midst of a wide stony watercourse. The princess walked slowly and looked up the river to see if there were any sign of the second flood. Suddenly she heard a whistling call from a clump of bushes. Ping, ping, ping. It was the call of her bridegroom, but he was nowhere to be seen. She then looked up the river once more and noticed for the first time that the stream was widening. Every moment it became fuller. Great boulders, which a minute ago were high and dry, were already half covered, and a dull roar could be heard far away. The high reaches were already in flood, and the king of the waters was waiting for his bride. Timber ran home and sought out her bridesmaids. "Come quickly," said she, "and bring everything we have made, but do not let anyone see us. The great king of the waters is waiting for me at the river." The bridesmaids ran hither and thither collecting all the pretty things they had made, while the bride arrayed herself for the marriage. In the Shangani country no one wears the kilt of black ox skins, so Timber put on a kilt of cotton cloth striped in red and blue, which reached to her knees, and a beautiful girdle of beads. Then she knotted on her left shoulder a cloak of dark blue cloth, heavily fringed in red and white. The cloth was very thin and hung in folds about her graceful form. Then she put the most beautiful bead necklaces about her neck, and covered her arms with bracelets cunningly woven of shining brass and copper wire. When all was done, it would have been difficult to find a prettier or more pleasing sight. Then the girls met again, and ran by hidden paths to the river without speaking a word to anyone. There the bridesmaids stopped and called to one another in astonishment, for the river was in full flood and was now over 1/2 mile wide. Great trunks of trees swept past in wild disorder, their branches tossing on the yellow waters. Now and then a dead buck floated by, and at every moment huge boulders swept past amid a deafening roar. The girls hurried on to the black pool. There the great thorn tree still stood out, but the water had already reached its lower branches. Overhead the sky was clear and cloudless, and the parched veldt, dotted with grey mimosa and leafless shrub, extended for endless miles to the transparent horizon. "Never have I seen such a flood," said one. "Surely the river is bewitched." "There has been no rain these 3 months," cried another. "Where can the waters have come from?" "Go home quickly," commanded the princess. "Leave everything here, and say nothing about me at the kraal." The bridesmaids were no sooner out of sight than the Serpent King raised his great flat head out of the water. As the princess watched him, he grew taller and taller, till at length he stood upon his tail and towered above her. His head reached the top of the high trees, and his body was like a black shining pillar. Then he fixed his bright eyes upon her and said, "Never be afraid of me, no matter what I do." "I will never be afraid of you," said the princess. "Are you quite sure?" said the serpent. "Quite sure," answered the princess. Then the serpent descended again and coiled himself beside her. "And now," said he, "what of the lobola? I must send that to your father, or our marriage is not complete." Footnote: Lobola, the marriage gift presented by the bridegroom to the bride's father. This gift, consisting of cattle, gives him his legal claim to his wife. End of footnote. "There is plenty of room in the great cattle kraal," said Timber. "They will understand when they see the oxen that my marriage gift is come." "Wait here," said the serpent. "I will return at moonrise." That night he sent the cattle, and at daybreak there was great commotion in the city. The princess had disappeared, and the air was full of strange bellowings, which came from the cattle kraal at the centre of the town. 100 splendid oxen were discovered there, finer than anyone had ever seen before. No one had seen them enter, and no herdsman was with them. For many a long day the mystery remained unsolved. In the meantime the princess waited. Darkness fell early, and for a long while only the stars could be seen in the clear sky. Then the long line of the eastern plains grew clearer and sharper, and slowly the wonderful winter moon arose. At that very moment the king of the waters raised his head from the pool and darted towards his bride. "The lobola is paid," he cried. "Come, let us go." Then Timber rose, and the serpent lifted her on his back. She put her arms round his neck, and they started to swim down the river under the great white moon. They passed the silent kraals and the empty fields, and they came to wide silvery plains stretching as far as the eye could see. The river flowed without sound, and all the time the king of the waters never spoke nor turned his head. As the dawn appeared, they reached the borders of a forest. For many an hour they had seen no kraal nor any human being, and here the bush was so thick that no one could hope to get through it. The great serpent took his bride to the bank and set her down. "Now, remember," said he, "never be afraid." Then he disappeared without another word. All that day Timber waited alone. As night approached, she expected to see the king once more, but no sign of him appeared. She shuddered as she heard the cries of the wild beasts searching for their prey. First, just after sundown, came the laughing cry of the jackal, then later the mournful howling of wolves. And as the night went on, she heard lions roaring close at hand. Once she heard a tiger grunting a few paces away, and it was all she could do not to scream out loud. But nothing hurt her, and at dawn all the strange sounds ceased. The next day she spent alone, thinking with terror of the approaching night. You can imagine her relief when, at moonrise, her bridegroom appeared once more. He took the princess again on his back, and once more they swam down the river, the dark forest on either side. They journeyed thus in silence for many hours. At dawn they were still in the heart of the forest. The trees were the tallest Timber had ever seen. Great festoons of creepers hung from the boughs, while below was a tangle of ferns and many strange plants. Then, suddenly, just as the sun rose, they entered a marvellous place, for the river opened out into a wide, still pool, surrounded by walls of dazzling white. The banks were of shining white sand, and the cliffs above of glittering mica, and in every nook and cranny grew the loveliest ferns. There were tree ferns all along the water's edge, with wide shady fronds, and trunks like those of an eastern palm. There were smaller ferns in endless variety, and at the very edge of the pool grew the most beautiful maidenhair. A wide belt of green lily leaves stretched out from the shore, framing the centre of the pool, which lay clear and placid as a mirror, reflecting the dazzling blue of the winter sky. Timber had never seen such a sight before. She longed to alight and rest among the ferns in the bright sunshine, but the king swam forward to the centre of the pool. There one could see far below to the white sanded bottom, for the water was like crystal. Here the serpent turned his head. "Follow me," he said. He glided under the water, and the princess followed. When she opened her eyes, she found they were far below in the depths of the water. The light was dim, and at first she could see nothing but the waving stems of the water lilies. Then she found they were standing before a group of most beautiful huts. The king took her to the largest and bade her enter. Strange to say, it was quite dry and very comfortable. In it she found all the pretty things which she had brought with her sisters to the riverbank, and all was in perfect order. She was very hungry and wanted to ask for food, but she did not dare say anything. The great serpent turned away and left her, saying, "I will return in the evening. Shut the door, but leave a little hole in the side of the hut for me to creep through. Food will appear whenever you desire it." And Timber found a delicious meal prepared in beautiful little pots. She enjoyed it after her long night's journey, but it was very dull and lonely, and there was nothing to do. The day passed, and as night drew on, it became very dark and cold. Timber lit a fire in the hut and shut the door, but remembered to leave a little opening as she had promised. Then she lay down to rest, tired and puzzled at her bridegroom's strange conduct. She was just about to sleep when she heard a snake's scales rustling against the thatch without. For the first time she was afraid as she heard him come. A moment later his head appeared at the little hole. His eyes flamed in the light of the dying fire as he entered and glided towards her. First he touched her feet, then her knees, and then passed right over her head, always in absolute silence. Then he turned round and slipped out once more by the way he had come. The princess spent the next day alone, and at night lay down again. But this time she could not think of sleep, and for hours she lay awake, tending her fire and watching the dark hole in the wall. At midnight she heard the rustling against the reeds outside. She began to tremble, but lay quite still and did not speak. The serpent entered as before, laid his head on her feet and her knees, and again glided over her and left the hut without a word. When he had gone, the princess breathed once more and composed herself to sleep. But as the next day advanced towards evening, she became more and more troubled. "Must I spend the end of my days here?" thought she. "Must I always live in this cold, dark place away from the sun? I shall soon die and never see my sisters again, or run with them through the mealie fields." Then she began to think of her former life, and remembered the many times she had met her lover among the tall lilies, and all the kindness he had shown her. "No," she said, "I must not despair. He will do me no harm. I must keep my promise and be brave." That night she lay in the hut by her wood fire and watched the hole in the wall. Hour after hour she listened for the familiar rustling, but no sound came. She could not sleep. Her head ached, and she was almost sick with fear. She threw her last bundle of sticks on the little fire. It was very cold. In the world above, the dawn must be at hand. The flames leapt up for the last time, and at that very moment a faint sound could be heard outside the hut. The king of the waters was there. He entered, his huge flat head erect and his eyes flaming. The princess nearly screamed, but clenched her hands to keep herself quiet. The serpent touched her feet, then her knees, and last of all her head. Timber closed her eyes and lay exhausted. All at once a light breeze seemed to blow on her face, and she looked up again to see what it might be. To her amazement she found she was again in the world above. The door of the hut was open, and before her stretched the enchanted pool, radiant and dazzling in the early morning sun. She turned to look for the serpent, but he was gone. In his place stood a magnificent man in the prime of life. He was very powerful, and so tall that his head nearly touched the roof. Glossy leopard skins hung from his broad shoulders, and round his waist were jackal skins fringed with tails of the mountain cat. On his arms and at his knees were bracelets of white oxtails, and in his hand he held a great staff beautifully carved. At one end a man's head was represented, and below it were tails of black and white cat skin. He was a very great chief indeed. Timber had never seen anyone so handsome before. Only his eyes seemed familiar. They were very bright and piercing. The princess gazed in wonder. Then the chief smiled. "Do not be astonished," said he. "I am the serpent, the great king of the waters. Years ago I was deprived of human form by a wicked magician. He belonged to a king who hated my father, but was never able to harm him because he was too powerful. One day this wizard met me walking alone by the river. By his black arts he turned me into a serpent. My only kingdom should be in the waters, and I was never to become a man again till I should find a bride without fear. At last I met you. Now I am a man once more. My father has long been dead, and my name is forgotten. So we must seek men and cattle, and make a new kingdom for ourselves. Take this staff, it will give you the power of a magician. You have only to hold it firmly in your hand, and you will gain the victory over the most powerful enemy. We will rest here a while, and then go forth together and make great conquests." Thus Timber obtained the reward of her courage, and became renowned and much beloved. I will tell you in the next story how she and her husband won their kingdom, and how at last she saw her home once more. So ends The Serpent's Bride, Part 1. Chapter 9 of Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs E. J. Burhill and Mrs. J. B. Drake. The Serpent's Bride, Part 2. The King of the Waters and his bride rested by the white pool for many weeks, making plans for the future and talking much together. They waited till the spring came, and then, as the early summer advanced, they set forth on their travels. For there were no tribes near them for many a day's journey, and the king needed great numbers of men and women to people his kingdom. It was no longer enough for him to command the wide river and reign alone at the white pool. The wicked king, whose magician had transformed him into a serpent, was long dead, and his nation dispersed, so that there was no one left on whom he might avenge himself. So the king and queen journeyed for days and days through the great forest, and then beyond through open flat country, till after many weeks they came to a new kingdom and people who did not know them. They travelled alone like ordinary folk, for they did not wish to be noticed. The first city they reached was small, but beautifully built on the side of a hill. Here they entered and talked with the chief. "Whose kingdom is this?" asked the king of the waters. "This is the kingdom of Volha Volha," said the Induna. "He is a great king and powerful." "Does he live near here?" asked the king. "Volha Volha lives 2 days' journey from here," said the Induna. "You follow the path over the hill and across 2 valleys. Then you come to our greatest city. But let me warn you, our king does not love strangers." The king of the waters smiled and thanked the Induna, and then turned to his wife. Timba, meanwhile, had been talking with the women, and as soon as they were alone, she said, "There is something curious about this city. The women seemed sad and frightened. They would hardly speak to me at all, and made excuses to get away. Did you notice how few children there are? There is some mystery here." "We will go on tomorrow towards the king's city," said her husband. "We shall discover what is amiss before long." The next morning they set out by the narrow path which led to the king's kraal. They left very early in the morning. It was cool and bright, for autumn was at hand, and the crops were already ripe in the valleys. They walked till midday, the king in front, spear in hand, casting his bright eyes here and there, so as to be ready for any enemy, and the queen behind, holding the magic staff, her blue mantle waving in the wind. At noon they came upon a second city, much larger than the first. The huts were neat and strong, and set in little circles surrounded by a fence. Little paths ran from one group of huts to another, for there were no wide roads at all, and a strong palisade encircled the whole town. Many people were moving to and fro, and one could see they were rich and prosperous, for the cattle kraal was very large and excellently built. The king and queen decided to wait here and ask more about the kingdom of Volha Volha. They came to the chief entrance and looked about them. Instantly everyone began to move towards their huts, more especially the women, as if they suspected strangers and were anxious to avoid them. "Why do the people look at us in this way?" said the queen. "We are alone and cannot harm them." At last a man came forward hurriedly with every mark of fear and led them to the Induna. There they again asked if they were on the road to Volha Volha's kraal. "Yes, you are on the right road," said the Induna briefly. Then he added, "You have never seen our country?" "We are strangers, my wife and I," said the Serpent King. "Our home is many days' journey from here." The Induna asked many more questions, and when he was satisfied that Timba and her husband really knew nothing of the country, he offered them food and rest, but he did not seem to wish to talk, and the king and queen soon continued their journey, for they wanted to reach the second valley before nightfall. "It is strange," said Timba. "In that city also I noticed but few children, and they were all copper-coloured, none were black. Yet these people are Shanganis like ourselves, and have dark skins." "We shall know soon," said the king. The afternoon was very hot. The morning freshness had gone, and there was a heavy feeling in the air. The narrow path mounted up and up, towards a great red cliff, which crowned the hill and extended for more than a mile. The king and queen followed its winding till they reached the foot of the crags. There the path turned and continued under the precipitous wall. Suddenly Timba cried out in horror. "What do you see?" said the king. "I saw white bones in the grass," said Timba. "Look, there are still more." "What can they be? They are not like the bones of animals." The husband and wife peered among the tall dry grass and the great boulders. Then they saw that all the ground at the foot of the cliffs was covered with little white bones. They looked like splintered wood, for they had lain there many months. Before long they understood the horror of their discovery, for Timber suddenly saw a tiny skull under a thorn bush. "Now I know," she cried. "These are the bones of tiny children, and that is why we saw so few in the cities. What can it all mean? Some dreadful monster must dwell in this land." "We will soon find out," said the king. "Let us move on quickly, for there is thunder in the air." They hurried forward, the king erect and gloomy, Timber in fear and sorrow, but grasping her staff firmly, for she felt it might soon be needed. The clouds rose higher and higher, and lightning began to play on the horizon like the flash of spears. They reached the top of the pass and saw a wide valley and, many miles away, a great city set on the ridge of a hill. Farther away to the right, the hill broke up into a succession of kopjes, so steep and rough that it was impossible to climb them. Footnote: Kopje, a small hill. End of footnote. The storm drew nearer, and great drops of rain splashed on the red dust. "We cannot reach the city tonight," said the king. "Let us seek shelter near at hand." They hurried on down the mountainside till they came to a gentle slope on which stood a tiny kraal. It contained but 3 huts and a small enclosure for cattle, but all was very strong and neat. On one side was a kind of platform supported by poles, and on this stood 6 immense baskets made of grass rope. These were waiting to be filled with grain at the coming harvest. Indeed, some were already full, for a young woman was anxiously arranging the cone-shaped lids, while glancing every now and then at the coming rain. As soon as she saw the strangers, she ran to a hut and crept in quickly, as if to avoid them. But Timber and the king were not surprised. They understood by now that some terror ruled the country, and that the people feared its coming at any moment. They went straight forward and begged for shelter. The young woman admitted them as if she dared not refuse. She was nearly as tall as Timber herself, and very beautiful, though her skin was as black as ebony. She was quite young too, but very grave and anxious, and started whenever the queen spoke to her. The storm was already upon them. The rain descended in torrents, and soon the entire hillside was seamed with little noisy streams. There was no question of going on till the next day, and presently the king and queen begged to stay the night at the kraal. The young woman, whose name was Siapi, took them to her hut. Her husband, she said, was away hunting, and she was in charge of the kraal. When the evening meal was over, she brought some sleeping mats for her guests. They were very strong and well woven. Indeed, all about the hut showed great neatness and order, and was a credit to its mistress. Then she spread her own mat on the floor. The door was closed, and presently all were asleep. At midnight, Timber woke suddenly to find the door ajar, and the cold night wind blowing in. The fire in the centre of the hut was nearly out, but there was enough glow from the dying embers to show that the corner in which the young wife slept was empty. Timber was much puzzled, and listened to hear if anyone was moving about. Suddenly she heard a baby's cry, followed by quick hushing and many caresses. Then she remembered again the ghastly red cliff and the frightened woman she had seen the day before. Without doubt, the young wife had a baby and was hiding it from some danger. Timber arose quickly, determined to know all. The clouds had not all dispersed, but the moon shone fitfully, and it was easy to see anything near at hand. Timber looked all round the little kraal, and presently, to her great surprise, she saw the young mother standing on the grain store and lifting out of one of the big baskets a beautiful little baby. Timber ran towards her, and poor Siapi screamed. "Oh," she cried, "do not betray me. Do not tell them about my little girl." "I will tell no one," said Timber. "But why are you afraid? What is the matter?" "Do you not know then?" said the poor mother with wide open eyes. "How should I? We are strangers. Every year, Volha, our king, kills every baby born in this country who is black. Only copper-coloured babies may live, for he is determined his people shall be black no longer. The time approaches for his spies to come and seize our little ones. Then his impis kill them with assegais and knobkerries and throw them over the great red cliff. We have no helper or defender. Volha is all-powerful. Every year he does bad deeds, but this is the most cruel of all. My little girl was born 3 months ago. She is as black as can be. I hid her here, for no spy climbs up to the grain store. But if they find her, I will not live. We will die together." "Do not fear any more," said the Queen. "I will help you." Then she stamped on the ground with her magic staff, and instantly there appeared the kindest old woman you ever saw. "Here," said the Queen, "is a very wise fairy. Give her your baby, and she will fly like the wind over hills and dales, and take her wherever you wish, to a place where kings do not kill babies." Siapi looked up in wonder and delight. "Take her to my sister," she said. "She will care for her, and I shall have nothing more to fear." So the old fairy took the baby, who cooed with delight in her arms. A moment later they were gone. "And now," said Timber, "we will rest, and tomorrow we will tell the king my husband." The next day Siapi told the Serpent King of her sad lot, and that of all her people, how they lived in hourly terror of spies, and thus dreaded the sight of any stranger, and how, no matter what they did, Volha was too clever and too cruel to allow them to escape. Then the King of the Waters burst into great wrath. "Such a man should die," cried he. "He shall pay with his own life for the tears of all these mothers." That evening, as the sun went down, he called Timber and Siapi and bade them follow him to a lonely spot out of sight of the kraal. Then he turned towards the Queen and said, "Hold your staff firmly while I summon my armies." He looked towards the mountain and shouted in a terrific voice, "Vuka panzi mabutu, sibulale volha. Rise, soldiers, let us kill Volha. He has slain every black baby. Rise, impis, rise. The pot is boiling over." And instantly there sprang from the ground a splendid impi of 1,000 men with flashing spears. 3 times did the king repeat the charm, and each time fresh men appeared. Then he placed them in order and bade them march upon Volha's city. He then told the Queen to stay at the kraal with Siapi, and to hold the magic staff in her hand day and night till he returned in triumph. As darkness fell, he and all his army disappeared like shadows down the mountainside. No one in all the country had seen them. They crossed the valley and climbed the great hill with amazing swiftness. At cockcrow they surrounded the city and fell on it with a sudden shout like thunder. Volha had no time to place his men in order, and fled in panic to his rocky stronghold, calling on his magicians to follow him. In an hour the King of the Waters held the whole of the chief city. But he had by no means obtained all he wanted, for his enemy was now hidden in the caves and inaccessible rocks which crowned the hill. There he had stored grain sufficient for many months, and with him were his magicians and the most wicked of his soldiers. They had long feared attack, and their stronghold was well prepared. Then followed a long, tedious fight, which lasted for many a day. Inch by inch the King of the Waters advanced into the stronghold, and one by one he killed all Volha's men. The wicked magicians, driven desperate, cast every spell they knew, but Timber sat with her staff in her hand day and night, and thwarted all their plans. At last the Serpent King reached the inmost defence of all, and there, among the thorns, Volha was discovered crouching at the back of a dark cave. His magicians had all been killed, and he was powerless to do any more evil. "Die like a dog," cried the warriors of the Serpent King. "Die, you who have killed all the black children." And they assegaied him at once. His body was thrown over the cliffs, and his name wiped out. Then the King of the Waters returned to his wife with great rejoicing, and told her they were now rich and powerful beyond belief. He sent orders to every city formerly held by Volha, bidding the inhabitants to come with him and live in a new country. They all rose up with one accord, and thus they journeyed, men, women and children, to the land near the great river. Many thousands of cattle went with them, and also large numbers of sheep and goats. Such wealth had never been seen before in the country. Now, as soon as the news came that Volha was really dead and his people free, the Queen sent a messenger to fetch the little baby girl she had rescued. The messenger had far to go, and when he returned with the little maiden, the king's new subjects were already beginning to build their kraals. The baby was given to the happy mother alive and well, but the messenger had gathered bad news as he travelled, for he heard that the people who lived about the Red Pool were coming in armed force to attack the King of the Waters. The river had been dry now for nearly a year. The rains had begun, and still the water did not rise, so that they feared starvation and ruin. When the King of the Waters heard this, he said to the Queen, "Come, let us go to the White Pool and give them water." So they both rose up and left their people and travelled through the forest till they came to the White Pool. It was now early summer. The ferns were renewing themselves in tints of tenderest green. The white sand and the glittering cliffs shone in the sun. But most beautiful of all were the water lilies. They covered the pool in thousands, silvery white and pale blue, with buds of delicate mauve. Above them hovered myriads of shining flies with wings of rainbow gauze. The air was warm and still, the water clear as could be, for the white pool was never empty, no matter how long the rains stayed away. "Now," said the king to Timber, "lift your staff and command the waters to rise, and let us return to your people." So Timber lifted her staff, and she and the king turned towards the upper streams. Everywhere they met little rivulets of water, which seemed to spring from the ground as they advanced. Soon the river was in full flood, and the King of the Waters and his bride swam together till they came to the Black Pool. There the lilies stood in thousands, creamy white and glorious to behold, and there the king and queen came to shore. "And now," said the king, "we will visit your father and make peace. And because of all I owe to you, the river shall flow forever, summer and winter, and shall never be empty again." Then Timber and her husband went to the kraal, and were received with much rejoicing. And when the old father saw the wonderful power of the King of the Waters, he said that he and all his people wished to live under the protection of such a mighty chief, and thus be free of all anxiety. So the two peoples became one, and the King and Queen of the Waters lived in joy and honour all their lives long. So ends The Serpent's Bride.